All right, so now that we've spent a bit of time with PaintFX, making plants that are primarily the plants that are part of the default library, what we want to do is now that we're fairly comfortable with creating PaintFX strokes and converting them to poly and rendering them, is to try and figure out how we can customize some of these plants because obviously very often you're going to need something that's not in the library. And so we're going to look at sort of the core attributes you might need to make some, let's say, basic plants. And you'll probably, use the paint effect strokes that are in here as a start point, but then modify them. So the first thing we'll do is let's say you want to make something like a bush. So that's a generic term, but if you think of a bush, you're going to probably be thinking of something, if I just grab some pictures off up or photos that I just grabbed on Google, things like this. So, different kinds of bushes where we can get an idea where it's something that's got, that's not very tall, maybe, maximum 4 feet or something like that. Um, and let's see, you could consider these to be bushes right here, where we can see the leaves are really, really tiny. Um, or these kind of bushes inside here. So there's obviously a bit of diversity in the shape of the leaves or the density. But if we take a look at the PaintFX library, you're not going to see a lot of choices. And so basically, the closest thing you'll find is under plants mesh. There is something actually called bushes. There's also this shrub, but these are really just going to be a start point for us. So let's say we grab this one called bushes and we just draw one in here. And now we'll switch back to the outliner. And the first thing we'll want to do is make this a little bigger. So I'm just going to go to the attribute editor. And in here, I'm just going to go to bushes. And let's just increase the global scale on this guy. So it's a little bit bigger. Maybe I'll make it even bigger than that. And this isn't much of a bush. And so obviously, we're going to want to make some changes and understand what the core parameters are so that we can create a variety of bushes with this as a start point. So to look inside here, if I just close everything out, the first step I would do is make sure the brush type is set to mesh. And so what that does is under the mesh folder, it activates tube sections. And so some presets you'll see are set to paint, but since we're going to be converting these to polys anyway, you might as well always set it to mesh. It activates tube sections, which right now is set to 6. And that's the tube sections going around. And so if I set it down to 4, or let's say 3, it's just going to lower the resolution and greatly reduce your poly count. In general, 4 is fine. And so I tend to leave it at 4. If something I know is going to be far away, I'll put it to 3. Sometimes, if you're doing something, like a tree, you might use something like 4 or 3, but then for the trunk, you want it to be higher res, but after you convert it to poly, you'll just smooth the trunk. Do a poly smooth. So that's step 1. Step 2 is if we go under tubes, you have your initial creation, which creates kind of like the main trunk. So let's say this trunk we have in here is being controlled by that, but there are some global settings that control all of the branches and twigs. So we have control over the width scale, the angle or the tube direction. So right now it's slanted a little bit. It's got a little bit of elevation. And then, of course, our growth for branches, twigs, leaves, and so on. So let's turn off the leaves and just focus on the trunk, the branches, and the twigs. So for something like this, the first thing that I would say is if we go up here under creation, you have segments. And so as opposed to your mesh sections. So sections is around, as we just saw. So we can see this is a square right there. It's got 4. But down here for segments, there's 7 segments going along the branches. So that's the first thing that I'll generally want to do is change that, because if you change it later, it'll completely change the look of the plant that you're creating. And 7 is a really low value. And so it can work for some things, but in general, I'm just going to put that to a higher amount. So let's say I put that to 20. You'll see immediately things look a little bit different. It's increased the amount of branching that we're getting. So 20 I kind of see as a really good start point for something, because if I go from 20 to 30, you'll see the look of the plant doesn't change as drastically. So if I start at 20, I know later on if I decide I need more, I can go to 30, but it still kind of looks the same, like the same plant, as opposed to the start point of 7, where you can see the difference between 7 and jumping to 30 is very dramatic. So let's say we leave it at 20. We're only at 1,000 polys, so not a big deal. So now, obviously, we have control in here under creation for length and width, which has to do with your initial trunk. And so if I go and increase the maximum length, you can see I can start getting the trunk longer, but we start to see our branches and twigs disappearing. And so just because there's a relationship between all of these, that can be a little bit confusing. And you'll definitely find when you're using PaintFX, there's going to be a lot of back and forth between the creation folder and your controls for your branches and twigs. So for something like a bush, since that's what we're trying to create, we're less concerned about the length of the initial trunk, because we're not trying to create a tree. So keeping it relatively short is fine, and focusing on how all of these branches and twigs are splitting off of that initial trunk. So if I go down here and turn off twigs and turn off branches, you can see there's that initial trunk. Another thing to point out is notice that if I turn branches on, we don't get anything. Only once I get twigs do I see it. And then if I turn off branches, we can see that I'm getting twigs and no branches versus turning twigs off and having no branches. That's a very important attribute to also kind of talk about first, which if you go down to the twig folder, you would tend to think that there's a trunk. Off the trunk are branches, and off the branches are twigs. And in general, in reality, that's the terminology you would use. But in PaintFX, under the twigs folder, because again, we only have our main tube, branches, and twigs on right now. Under the twigs folder is a checkbox called branch after twigs. Some of the presets will have that on, and some will have it off. So if I turn it off, then you can see the look changes quite a bit. And what's happening is now you have your tube, which then can branch, and then off the branch you can get twigs. If you turn branch after twigs on, then basically the branches come after the twigs. So I like that for a lot of things, just because it seems to give you a lot more control over getting branching at the tips or at the ends. You'll see I'm getting a lot more branching out here, as opposed to when that is off and I'm getting more of my branching clustered towards the center. And so I'm going to leave that on. And so now what changes might we make for making something like a bush? Well, I'm not concerned again with my leaves right now. We'll get to that later. So I'm just trying to understand the basics here with branches and twigs. So if we look at our branches, you can see that start branches is at 0, number of branches is at 2. And you'll notice that whenever it splits into 2 branches. So if I put that to 3, you'll see now it splits into 1, 2, 3 branches. So clearly you have to be careful with that attribute, because that's going to increase your poly count, but also is very important to control the overall density of what you're creating. So then underneath that, you'll see you have split max depth, which is very important. It has to do with the depth at where the split occurs. So how far down the branch it splits into more branches, or how far down the twig. And so for something like a bush, it obviously depends on what your reference is, where some bushes might have long branches that then split, while some might branch a lot further down. So this is a very, very critical attribute right there for the overall look. So then you'll see branch drop out. It just randomly removes some of the branches. So it's usually good to have a little bit of branch dropout, because if you don't, things are going to look very, very spherical or very, very round. So by introducing a little bit of branch dropout, you can get things to have a little bit more of a random look to them. So if I go in and be like, all right, well, I've got my number of branches to 2, so it splits into 2 branches. I've controlled the depth, but then I look at this and be like, well, it's not very dense. There's not a lot of branches in there. So that's going to be controlled by not necessarily just the number of branches, but remember we're branching after the twigs, which is this checkbox. So the more twigs we have, the more core branching or branches we have, let's say. So right now, twigs and cluster is 1. And so you'll see you get 1 twig there, 1 twig there. If I put twigs and cluster to 2, you'll see now at the same point along the trunk, we now split twice. And there we split twice. So that is a good way to increase your overall density. If I put that back down to 1, we can also increase the number of twig clusters. And so right now it's at 10. So if I put that to 20, we're going to get a lot more of them. They're just not going to be all at exactly the same place along the trunk. And so that looks a little bit more organic for what we're doing inside here. So really my density at this point I'm controlling by the number of twig clusters. So at this point, we're starting to get something that maybe is working for us as a generic bush. So now if we look at it and decide, well, there's a lot of straight lines in here. You first have to think, well, if this is going to be completely covered with leaves, I might not see that. But if you want things to be, smoother, you would of course need to increase up under creation your segments. So here the segments are at 20 like we did. If I put it to 30, put it to 40, you'll see that those straight lines get shorter because it's increasing the density or the segments on this. And right now we're only at 4,500. So when I'm creating things and I know I'm going to be instance copying them around the scene, I really am not too concerned if one of my bushes or plants or trees or whatever is, anywhere up to, 1 or 200,000 polygons. And so obviously you want to be relatively efficient, but, I've rendered, up to 10 billion polygons before via not instancing, but mental ray proxies. With instancing, though, I can go up to about 700 million polygons without a problem. So it's really an issue of what your core polygon count is before instancing. So in the end, leaving this, let's say, at 30 is still going to be fine because we're at such a low polygon count, or 40 even. Okay, so now that we have this, and it's starting to feel a little bit more like the understructure of a bush, because obviously we can always go and turn our leaves on to sort of, see what's going on. But clearly there's an issue of scale here with those leaves, where if we remember some of the photos that we looked at, the relative size of leaves, is obviously a lot smaller than what we're getting inside here with this default. But again, I'm focusing on the substructure. So I've got this as my initial bush. Now what else might I do? Well, I'm looking at this and thinking, well, the trunk is really thick there at the base. So I'm going to go up to creation, and that's going to be my tube width in 1, because remember the creation folder is your trunk in a way, with some global variables like segments. So I'm going to go and reduce the width a little bit to make it a little bit skinnier. And then I'm going to go back down. And let's say, the angle that this is at, if I put the elevation to 1, it's going to stand straight up. So I can always put a little bit of an angle inside here. But for this bush, I can always angle this, in other ways via rotation. I just want you to understand that the angle is coming from the tube direction on our, again, main trunk. And then we go down and we get back to our branches. So our split max depth, again, is how far down the twig it's branching. So I'll just go and mess with that. A little bit of branch dropout. We can randomize where the split points are. We can control the angle at which it splits. And so as we go and increase that angle, it's going to fill out the bush a little bit better, as opposed to having it be narrow. And you have split twist. So this attribute in general, you're going to leave at 0.5 or negative 0.5. If I put it to a value of 0 inside here, what you'll find is that, it's a little bit hard to see unless I rotate, but they're all kind of at the same angle relative to the twig that they're splitting off of. While if you put it to if you put the split twist to a value of 0.5, it's going to look a lot more natural. So in some of the other things we'll create, that'll be a little bit more obvious, but generally I leave split twist at 0.5. Size decay. as it splits into smaller, twigs and branches, how do you want to control the size decay? And so if I lower the size decay, they get smaller, or I can have them actually get bigger than what they're splitting off of. So I'm going to go and mess with that a little bit. So I'm not going to talk about every single attribute because some are more, important than others. You can obviously play with everything, but you can see the split bias inside here is controlling a bias for splitting. But in here, the value that it was at was kind of all right, which was 0. We can specify a minimum size for branches and a middle branch, which we don't need. That's more useful for like having a middle branch going up a tree trunk. And then down to my twigs. So I'm going to look inside here and be like, all right, well, my twig length, I can go and modify a little bit. The twig base width, adjusting. Where the twig starts along the core trunk. So if I put it here, you can see it's going to look more like a tree. So obviously I want my twigs to start a little bit lower. The angle that the twigs split off the trunk. So we have angle 1 as well as angle 2. So angle 1 is kind of the angle down here, and angle 2 is the angle up here at the top of the trunk. So I'm going to leave the angle on these, let's say, somewhere around there. Twig twist, I'm going to leave it around 0.5. If I put this to 1, you can see from the top view, it's kind of looking straight. If I put it to 0.5, it fills out better in a circular array. All right. Length scale is adjusting the length of the twigs as they emit off of the trunk. So you'll see there's these points inside here, and you'll see that the scale is very low at the bottom of the trunk. So I can increase that so that the twigs that are near our lower point on the trunk are longer. And so the fact that there's a little bit of variety in here, you can see I can go and adjust it. So I can have the twigs that are at the top of the trunk be shorter. So in general, for a bush, I'm less concerned about this. So I could even go in here and delete all these, which means they're all going to have the same size. Or I can go and make some adjustments in here if I want to. And I'm just going to also adjust my angle a little bit. I was getting a funny little straight line in there that was coming from the angle. Okay, so then going up here, our twig dropout is at 0. I'm going to up that a little bit just so randomly remove some twigs. And then now I'm going to increase the number of twig clusters, maybe to 30. And as we can see, we're starting to create just the general start for our bush. So I'm just going to lower the angle a little bit that they emit from at the base. Okay. So let's say we're fine with this as sort of a start point for the substructure of this bush, and now we want to get some leaves in there. So if we review what we've talked about, we converted to mesh, made the sections for, under creation we put the segments initially at 20, now at 40, control the length of the main trunk that's inside there and its width. We didn't randomize or control the segment length bias or segment width bias. This basically allows you to, by default at 0, the segments along the branches are evenly spaced. If you adjust the length bias, you can get the segments to bias themselves towards the tip of a branch. So you can see here I have larger segments here and smaller segments at the tip. And so in here I'm going to leave that at 0. And under our branches, we have a branch point at 2. Our split depth, we adjusted as well. And all right, cool. So now what else is going to control the look before we get into leaves? We also have our stiffness. Stiffness on the twigs. So this is something that's not doing a lot right now just because we're using branch after twigs. So if you want to control or get this thing to, let's say, fall with gravity or whatever, you'll still be able to do that, but that's going to be under behavior. So before we get the leaves in here, I'm going to go under behavior, and let's get a little bit of gravity inside here so we can start to see how the gravity is going to affect it, as well as the ability to add a little bit of random behavior into this bush. So maybe I'll add a little bit of rand inside there. And then I think that the twigs at the bottom here are a little long. So I'm going to go to my twig length scale, and I can shorten the branches a little bit at the base. So I can get them really small, or just shorten them a little bit. Maybe a little bit more. Okay. So now let's put some leaves on here. So going to leaves, I'm going to turn that on, and we can see they're huge. So I'm going to now scroll down to my leaf folder. So the first thing I want to do with my leaves is get these to be smaller. So we have under leaves, length, width at the base, width at the tip. So I'm just going to say, well, maybe 0.01, 0.01, 0.01. Now they're a lot smaller inside here. So maybe it's a little too small, so 0.05, 0.05, 0.05. Yeah, a little big, 0.03, 0.03, 0.03. Usually you're going to want them to be relatively square because you're going to have a texture with a cutout opacity that's going to create the transparency for your leaf. So not always, because sometimes it's still nice to use paint effects to be able to use the same leaf texture but design the overall shape. And then what's going to be important here to evaluate? Okay, well, in here you can see it's already looking like a bush. So it's already looking like, a different kind of bush than what the preset was. The density is not very high, but we're leaving the density kind of low just for interactivity purposes. And going into my bush, one thing I should probably do at this point is save. So my project, kit of parts, and save as, let's call this tutorial bush 01. All right. And for my leaves, a few things we need to understand. So let's go and find a single leaf and look at it. Right now they look all crinkled up. Let's try and get them to just be completely straight squares to start. And so if we look at the leaf, I'm not concerned with this stuff. This has to do with density. You'll see that there's width scale, which isn't really set, and twist and angle and so forth. But there's something called bend, which you can see has a value. I'm going to put that to 0. And then you'll see there's stiffness. I'm going to put that to 1. And then you can see that this attribute has for curl is also set. I'm going to get rid of that and turn it off by putting it to 0.5. And now you can see all of my leaves are squares. So again, if you want to use this as a start point, generally it's nice to just get them to all be flat squares as a start. And then you can go in and start to mess with things inside here. So if I put the leaf segments now to 1, they really are just flat squares. So if you want them to have some curl or bend to them, clearly you're going to need more than one segment. So if I put the segments to 4, like it was, obviously your poly count when you have a lot of these is going to increase. So it really depends on, how close this is going to be to camera and how important it's going to be for these to have a bend to them. So if we look at these pictures, you can see in some of them you wouldn't necessarily notice, while something like this, it's like, well, do the leaves on these bushes look like they're bending? They definitely are a little bit. So looking at some of these leaves inside here. So it's just a matter of, again, how close they are to camera. So I'll leave the segments at 4, though, just so we can understand how we can add a little bit of bend. So the first thing to point out with the bend is that some of the bend comes with gravity. So if you have gravity on, which we do, under behavior, forces, gravity, actually we don't. Let's introduce a little bit of gravity in here. So as I introduce a little bit of gravity, we can see the branches go down a little. And then now if I go back up to the leaves, I can now go and lower the stiffness down, and you'll see that they're going to start to bend, and they're falling with gravity basically. And so while there is this leaf bend attribute up here, you also can control it just via gravity and stiffness. If I leave the stiffness at 1 and I use the leaf bend, you can see you can also use that to create a bend that's not really related to the gravity. Okay, so this is where your number of segments is important. So this is causing a bend in this direction. If you also want the leaves to bend in the opposite direction, which a lot of leaves do curl, so that's where this comes in. So you can see the moment you introduce a value other than 0.5, you'll see there's no division down the center here. If I adjust the curl, all of a sudden it inserts one. So you can see now how my leaves are curling. So the nice thing is you can get the leaf to curl in one direction at the base of the leaf, but you can also get it to bend in another direction at the other end of the leaf. So if you look at reference, you'll see that a lot of leaves, do emit or grow out of the twig with this kind of curl at the base, but then kind of flatten out at the tip. While some leaves stay curled all the way, and there are some leaves, but it seems to be a little more rare, that actually curl that way starting at the root. So I'm going to add a little bit of bend in that direction, a little bit of curl in that direction. And then I can also lower the stiffness down so they also interact with gravity. And so at this point, this is kind of in general, how I would get leaves to look, knowing my core attributes: leaf bend, leaf curl, related to leaf segments, and of course leaf stiffness. And whenever you see anything having to do with translucence, specular, color, you can ignore it because that's all going to come from the MIA material you're going to create. So what else is important? You'll see in here an attribute called leaf twirl. So you can see that that's also rotating all of the leaves. So you can see that for the look of this bush, it's kind of irrelevant. It's almost kind of like it's randomizing it. And then a critical attribute, leaf face sun. This depends on the plant that you're doing, but on a lot of plants, you'll find that the leaves do face the sky or face the sun. And so by default, it's at 0 because this is an attribute that's relatively new in Maya. It was added in the last couple of years. And so because of that, most of the presets don't have that, even though you'll see that if I put leaf face sun to 1, now all of the leaves are kind of facing the sky. And now we can see that this bend attribute really should be a positive number to get them to be looking like they're bending with gravity. So this look that we have now is going to be a lot more believable for lots of plants. Leaf face sun at 1. And if you're going to choose to use a bend, then make it positive, as opposed to having them bend towards the sky. They're bending away from it with a little bit of gravity. So yeah, so now at this point, with this set, you can always use leaf face sun where you don't have it at just 0 or 1, but maybe they're kind of biased towards the sky, but not completely. It can be a little bit more randomized if you want. And what else might we want to change? Well, those are the basic things inside here. So I think at this point, if we look at this, we can decide, all right, well, that's kind of like a generic bush. The issue would be maybe I want more leaves. So I would go up here and control number of leaves in cluster and number of leaf clusters. So when I'm designing anything with paint effects, I generally keep things that have to do with leaves in cluster and number of clusters, as well as the twigs in cluster and number of twig clusters, and then of course the number of branches at low numbers in the beginning, just so everything's interactive while I move sliders. And then when I'm getting close to being done, then I'll start to bump it up if I need increased density. So if I decide, well, I think I want more leaves along each branch, then I could go down to the leaves, and you just need to understand the difference between leaves in cluster and number of leaf clusters. So if I put leaves in cluster to 4, then you're just going to end up finding groups of 4 leaves that are kind of growing together, as opposed to, oops, I just jumped around, as opposed to leaves, having the leaves in cluster lower, but having lots of leaf clusters. So I just raised it to 10 from a value of 3. So now this is starting to feel a little bit more bush-like. And so we can see we have this, empty space in here. So how would we fill that? Well, not with more leaves. We would need more twigs. So if I go up here, I could increase the number of twig clusters to increase the density of this bush. Sometimes it's nice to have these kind of, empty spaces inside here, just because it's going to allow you to make things look a little bit more organic and random, as opposed to a big ball. Let's go and put that to, let's say, 50. And we could go in here, and now we're at 40,000 polygons, just to point out. Looks pretty good. Maybe I'll choose to, I can go and adjust the twist just a little bit. And I think that looks like a pretty good generic bush. And there you go, making a bush. So as far as this bush versus some of the other bushes you might see in references, it's really going to be an issue of the, the size of the leaves. And then the orientation of the leaves to the sky. And so the general structure of branching inside there, you just want to make sure, if I turn the leaves off inside here, that you have a nice network of branches, because a big bush that's got lots of leaves on it only has lots of leaves because there's lots of branching and lots of twigs inside there. So it is very important to have a lot of this going on as your main core structure underneath. And so, all right, so if this is, let's say, a generic bush, and let's save our scene. If we now try and remember what the PaintFX bush looked like, so let's go to Visor, and let's go to PaintFX Mesh, go to Bushes, and draw one of those in there. And again, we did make it a lot bigger. But you can see that, in the end, the bush we created versus the default PaintFX bush is going to be, for most purposes, a little bit more useful. This feels a lot less like a bush, maybe, a useful start point for some ground cover. So, but there you go. And so what might we want to do with this bush? Well, at this point, maybe you want to have more than one bush. So I can go and take this and say, I like the settings as I have them here. So I don't want to start messing around with them as a, bush A. So maybe I'll call them custom bush A. If I want to now make custom bush B, I'll select that, or both of those nodes. I'll duplicate them. And I can just say duplicate input graph, so it duplicates them with all the connections between them. And then I can take the copy and move it to the side. And so now these are two identical PaintFX strokes. But then on the copy, which I'll call custom bush B, I can go to the attribute editor and randomize the seed value, which would mean it's basically the same bush, it's just randomized a little bit. So you can see now, it looks pretty much the same. The only thing is that you can see it chose to also randomize the start point of where the twigs originate off the trunk, which we may want to adjust. But we can also just play with the seed value some more, and you can see we're getting, at this point, maybe that one is one we like. So being able to adjust the seed value is awesome. And so you can see now we have these two bushes. So what else might I want to point out? So anyway, that's how to copy and make some general changes. So if on this bush on the right I decide, well, maybe I want to fill in the bottom, or control how it's touching the ground. It's important to now point out another attribute, which is on your bush, which under tubes, close everything, is under behavior. And inside here, under forces, you'll see that this has deflection on. So deflection means that the strokes, or the part of the bush that's close to the ground, is trying to not go through the ground. If I turn that off, you'll see you're going to get this. So it's trying to avoid intersecting the ground. And so sometimes you'll want that on, sometimes you won't. But it's very important to understand what that does. So if I turn deflection back on, you can see I can go and adjust, where the deflection affects the plant. And so by adjusting it like this, you can see that now looks kind of cool. So basically it's like some of the branches at the bottom are actually just sort of hitting the ground and moving along it, which feels a little bit, maybe more along the lines of what you're looking for. So deflection is very important to edit when you really want to change the look at things at the base. So if I go to this bush, I might decide, I think I'm going to adjust deflection max also down on this guy a little bit. There we go. So I have a collection of leaves hitting the bottom. All right. So 2 bushes based on the same general settings. And then what I tend to do is, I just have these scenes sitting around. So it's easy for me to import these customized bushes, plants, or whatever into my own scenes. And so obviously we would still need to go and make, shaders for it, but that's going to be related to everything else that we've already done. But if I do choose to convert these to polys, we would want to remember to also go inside here and under Mesh Output, turn on Output Quads for these. And then since I'm not dealing with animation right now, or wind or anything like that, I could then leave construction history off before converting it to poly. And so wind is something that we get into when I get onto doing trees with paint effects and doing wind and whatnot. So all of that stuff I talk about with trees obviously can apply to plants. But for now, I'm going to leave construction history off. I'm going to modify, convert paint effects to polygons, quad output, poly limit at 0, so it doesn't give me a limit. It'll just convert it. And now I have raw geometry. And so I'll save my scene. So what I'll do real quick is just show you, we'll real quick just, render these out just so we can see what these bushes look like. But let me pause for a sec.